Picture a village called Riu tucked into a green valley in the far northeast of India. A river runs beside it called the Siang. The people here don't just use this river, they worship it. They call it Ane Siang, Mother Siang. An old farmer there named Tapir Jamo, 69 years old, says something that should stop you cold. If the river is dammed, we also cease to exist. He is not talking about China, he is talking about his own government. That one sentence holds the whole story we are about to tell. Because everyone assumes it's a simple tale of China threatening India's water. And yes, that threat is real. But the full story is stranger, messier, and far more uncomfortable than the headlines suggest. Let's start with the facts nobody disputes. High up on the Tibetan plateau, a river begins its life. The Chinese call it the Yarlung Tsangpo. It flows east, then makes an extraordinary turn. Geographers call it the Great Bend before crashing down toward India. In just about 30 miles, the river drops nearly 6,500 feet. That is one of the steepest falls of any major river on the planet. In engineering terms, it is a gift, enormous energy sitting there waiting to be captured. China is capturing it. Construction began in the summer of 2025 on what will be the largest hydropower project ever built by human beings, bigger than the Three Gorges Dam, which currently holds that record. The new project, centered near the town of Madog, is designed to generate around 60 gigawatts of electricity. To put that in perspective, that is nearly three times the output of the Three Gorges. China's premier called it the project of the century, but here is what most coverage leaves out. This is not one dam. It is a network of five separate power stations fed by tunnels bored more than 12 miles through the mountain, redirecting the river's own path before it even reaches the open valley. Beijing describes it as run of the river, a term meant to sound reassuring, meaning the water is not being stored, only passed through. But a system engineered to reroute a river through miles of tunnel is not just generating power. It is gaining the ability to control timing and pressure in a way a simple concrete wall never could. There is also a quieter danger underneath all of this. The Great Bend sits almost exactly where the Indian and Eurasian tectonic plates meet, one of the most earthquake prone stretches of ground on the planet. Building the largest hydropower complex in human history on top of an active fault line is not a side note. It is a risk that both governments know about and that neither one likes to discuss out loud. Now follow the river further. It crosses into India's Arunachal Pradesh, where it is called the Siang. It gathers more tributaries and becomes the Brahmaputra as it crosses Assam, a lifeline for tens of millions of people, feeding farmland, fisheries, and cities before it finally reaches Bangladesh. Here is the detail that should worry you more than the dam itself. China has not shared river flow data with India since 2022. That data, rainfall, snowmelt, upstream river levels, is exactly what lets India's disaster agencies predict floods before they hit. Without it, communities downstream are quite literally flying blind. The silence began right after a deadly border clash between Indian and Chinese soldiers in the Himalayas in 2020. That timing is not something anyone in New Delhi believes is a coincidence. So, when Indian officials warn about a Chinese water bomb, they are not simply being dramatic, they are describing a real strategic fact. The country that controls the tap no longer has to explain what it is doing with it. There is, though, a piece of nuance almost nobody mentions when this story gets told for shock value. India actually sits on a smaller share of the Brahmaputra's drainage basin than Tibet does, yet it contributes the large majority of the river's total water thanks to monsoon rainfall that dwarfs anything Tibet receives. China cannot simply switch off the Brahmaputra and leave Assam dry. What it can do is control the timing of releases with far more precision than India can ever predict, turning a river that farmers have read for centuries into one that behaves unpredictably. The threat was never really about the water disappearing. It is about who decides when it arrives and how much of it comes at once. Here is where the story most people stop telling gets interesting. India's answer to all of this was not diplomacy. It was a dam of its own, just across the border in the very same river valley. Before the Siang has even fully entered Indian territory, the government proposed something called the Siang Upper Multipurpose Project. If completed, it would be India's largest dam ever, a wall of concrete close to 300 meters high, holding back a reservoir large enough to fill roughly 4 million Olympic swimming pools. The stated purpose is blunt: build enough storage to absorb a sudden, weaponized surge of water from China so that a flash flood from upstream does not drown Assam. It sounds like a reasonable defense right up until you meet the people who actually live where this dam is meant to be built. The reservoir would submerge dozens of villages and affect more than 150,000 people, mostly from the Adi tribal community, families who have farmed this valley for generations. and whose language, spirituality, and identity are woven into this exact stretch of river. When government survey teams arrived to measure the land, armed federal police arrived with them. Villagers say the consent documents required for the project were collected under pressure, sometimes without residents fully understanding what they were signing away. A local lawyer and activist named Ebo Mili, who has spent years opposing the project, has been detained multiple times for organizing protests against it. At one point, his whereabouts were unknown for long enough that human rights groups grew seriously alarmed for his safety. And here is a detail that undercuts the official story even further. In 2022, a regional high court actually cancelled dozens of proposed dams on this same river, citing exactly these kinds of concerns. The government pressed ahead with new plans anyway, and in 2023, changes to national forest law exempted this specific project from the usual environmental clearance process altogether. In other words, the same legal and environmental safeguards that exist for ordinary infrastructure projects were quietly waived for this one, precisely because it was framed as a matter of national security. So, think about what is actually happening here. A government tells its people that an enormous dam must be built immediately, without full consultation, because a hostile foreign power might one day weaponize water against them. And in the process of building that defense, it does something startlingly similar to its own citizens right now. It overrides local consent, deploys force to secure the site, and treats objections as an obstacle to national security rather than a legitimate grievance. The dam being built to protect people from a hypothetical future threat is inflicting a very real, very present one on people who never got a meaningful vote in the decision. Now, here is the part of this story that almost nobody puts side by side because it is uncomfortable in a very specific way. In April of 2025, after a terrorist attack killed dozens of tourists in Indian administered Kashmir, India did something it had never done in 65 years, not through wars, not through decades of hostility with Pakistan. It suspended the Indus Waters Treaty, the agreement governing how river water flowing from India into Pakistan gets shared. Within days, India had stopped water flow through one dam on the Chenab River and carried out unannounced flushing operations at two others, releasing and redirecting water without informing Islamabad of the treaty's normal schedule, while the agreement was still officially only in abeyance. Pakistan called it an act of war. Its army chief reportedly warned that Pakistan would destroy any future dam India built there with, in his words, 10 missiles. Sit with that for a second. The exact behavior India fears from China as the upper riparian power, cutting off data, controlling flow, using water as leverage during a moment of political tension, is precisely what India did to Pakistan the moment it decided its national interest required it. India is not a country with some unique moral commitment to river sharing that China simply lacks. India is a country that, when it holds the upstream position, behaves the way upstream powers tend to behave. The complaint about China was never really about principle. It is about position. Everyone wants to be the one holding the tap, and everyone becomes far more comfortable with leverage the moment they are the ones holding it. That is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this entire story. And it is a large part of why a real solution keeps not happening. Here is a fact that surprises most people. There is no binding water sharing treaty between India and China at all, not one. The only real mechanism, something called the expert level mechanism, set up back in 2006, is a modest arrangement in which China voluntarily hands over some flood season data during the monsoon months. It carries no legal force. China has never signed on to the main international convention meant to govern rivers that cross borders, and India, to be fair, has never pushed hard enough to force a stronger, binding alternative into existence either. You would think, given the stakes, someone would be building a real institution, something closer to the river commissions that manage the Mekong or the Danube, with permanent staff, shared satellite monitoring, live data feeds, and enforceable rules that do not simply evaporate the moment politics gets tense. This is entirely possible with existing technology. Modern satellites can already track snowmelt, rainfall, and reservoir levels in near real time, treaty or no treaty. But building that kind of institution means both governments giving up something they would rather keep, which is uncertainty as leverage. A country that shares full, continuous data and submits to outside monitoring cannot quietly hold open the option of using that control later. Ambiguity is a tool, and right now, both Beijing and New Delhi appear to prefer holding that tool over locking it away inside a treaty. 2025 just proved that even a 65-year-old War tested water agreement can be set aside in a matter of hours the moment a government decides it needs to send a message. Given that, why would either side sign something new and actually expect it to hold the next time tensions rise? There is one more piece of this that is easy to miss because it does not involve a single government official, it involves us, the audience. Stories about water bombs and rival superpowers get enormous attention online. They are built for outrage, for national pride, for clicks, and every time one of these stories spreads without anyone asking who actually pays the price, it strengthens a very specific political incentive. Build the big dramatic countermeasure, skip the slow, unglamorous work of consultation and treaty negotiation because the public wants to see decisive action against a foreign threat, not a multi-year diplomatic process nobody will watch a video about. Politicians on both sides understand this well. The tribal families losing their ancestral land rarely trend. The absence of a real data sharing agreement rarely trends. A giant dam with a dramatic nickname does. It is tempting to treat all of this as a slow moving story, something that plays out over the next decade while the rest of us watch from a safe distance. It isn't. The tunnels are already being bored. The survey teams and the armed police already stood in the same fields together. The court order that cancelled 44 dams on the Siang back in 2022 has already been quietly worked around. Ebo Mili has already been detained three separate times for opposing a project that is already under construction. None of this is a projection sitting somewhere in the future. It is happening on the calendar we are already living in. And the risk that nobody even needs to activate on purpose is the one sitting directly underneath both projects. This entire stretch of river runs along the seam where the Indian and Eurasian tectonic plates are still colliding, one of the most seismically restless regions on the planet. Engineers on both sides know this. It shows up in project reviews and academic papers, and it gets noted and then quietly set aside every time construction moves forward anyway. Nobody needs to weaponize a single drop of water for this to turn catastrophic. A major earthquake in a region that produces them regularly, striking a network of tunnels and reservoirs holding back this much water, could send a wall of water toward tens of millions of people across Assam and Bangladesh without a single political decision being made anywhere. And because there is still no live data sharing agreement between China and India, even that kind of disaster would arrive with almost no warning at all. That is the detail that should actually keep you up at night, not some hypothetical future where a government presses a button to flood a rival on purpose. A fault line already active, running directly beneath two of the largest engineering projects on Earth, built by two governments that still will not share basic information with each other about the very ground they are both standing on. The story we are usually told is simple. China threatens India's water and India must defend itself. That part is true. But it's not the whole truth. The fuller version is a story about two upstream powers, each one perfectly willing to treat water as a weapon the moment it serves their interest, each one demanding transparency from a rival while denying it to their own citizens, and a river valley full of people caught in the middle of a fight over control that was never really about them at all. So, the next time you see a headline about a water bomb on the Brahmaputra, ask the question almost nobody asks out loud: is this really about protecting a downstream population or about which government gets to hold the tap?